Before we come to the statement, I would like to remind the House that on issues which may relate to ongoing cases relating to vulnerable children, members will wish to take care to avoid saying anything that could prejudice any cases that are currently before the courts or which might come before the courts at a later date. Statement, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Monday, I set out the actions this government is taking forward to tackle the terrible crimes of child sexual exploitation and abuse, including mandatory reporting, a new victims and survivors panel, an overhaul of data and police performance requirements, tougher sentences for perpetrators and support for local inquiries, including in Oldham. The Safeguarding Minister is this morning meeting with survivors from Oldham, and earlier this week she and I met Professor Alexis Jay, who chaired both the 7-year National Independent Inquiry into child sexual abuse and the first local independent inquiry into grooming gangs in Rotherham. Professor Jay's strongest message to us was that the survivors who bravely testified to terrible crimes committed against them must not be left to feel that their efforts were in vain, because despite all the inquiries, no one listened and nothing was done. So following those discussions, I therefore want to update the House on our next steps, both to take forward inquiry recommendations and to go further in tackling sexual exploitation and grooming on the streets and online to keep children safe. The Independent National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse completed its final report in 2022. It took 7 years, heard 7,000 personal testimonies and considered 2 million pages of evidence. They were devastating accounts of brutal rapes, sexual violence, humiliation, trauma, betrayal of vulnerable children by those charged with protecting them, and people in positions of power who shamefully put the reputation of institutions before the protection of children. The inquiry included separate detailed reports on organised child abuse in residential homes and schools, abuse and cover-ups in the Catholic and Anglican churches, and a 2-year inquiry published in February 2022 into child sexual exploitation by organised networks and grooming gangs, which itself examined over 400 recommendations made by previous inquiries and serious case reviews, as well as taking further evidence of its own. And there have been further reports since then, including on Telford and on police performance. But despite all those national inquiries, reports, and hundreds of recommendations, far too little action has been taken. And shamefully little progress has been made. That has to change. So before Easter, the government will lay out a clear timetable for taking forward the 20 recommendations from the final IICSA inquiry report. 4 of those are specifically for the Home Office, and I can confirm we have accepted them in full, including on disclosure and barring, and work on these is already underway. A cross-government ministerial group is considering and working through remaining recommendations, and that group will be supported by our new Victims and Survivors panel. In addition, I can confirm today that the government will implement all the remaining recommendations in the Child Abuse Inquiry's separate standalone report on grooming gangs from February 22, including updating key department education guidance. So let me turn to the areas where we need to go further. As I said last week, the most important task should be to increase police investigations into these horrific crimes and get abusers behind bars. We will introduce stronger sentences for child grooming, making it an aggravating factor to organise abuse and exploitation. And I can announce new action today to help victims get more investigations and prosecutions underway. I'm extending the remit of the Independent Child Sexual Abuse Review Panel, so it covers not just historic cases before 2013, but all cases since, so that any victim of abuse will have the right to seek an independent review without having to go back to the local institutions who decided not to proceed with their case. I'm writing today to the National Police Chiefs Council to ask all Chief Constables to look again at historic gang exploitation cases where no further action was taken, and to work with the Police Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force to pursue new lines of inquiry and reopen investigations where appropriate. And these new measures will be backed by £2 million additional funding for the task force and the panel. And all police forces will be expected to implement the 2023 recommendations from His Majesty's Inspectorate, including producing problem profiles on the nature of grooming gangs in their area. And I have asked the Inspectorate to review progress this year. But as well as reviewing past cases, we also need much stronger action to uncover the full scale and nature of these awful crimes. The Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force, led by the National Police Chiefs Council, has estimated that out of the 115,000 child sexual abuse offences recorded by the police in 2023, around 4,000 involved more than one perpetrator. Of those, they identify around 1,100 that involved abuse within the family, over 300 involving abuse in institutions, and they identified 717 reported cases of group or gang-related child sexual exploitation. But we know the vast majority of abuse goes unreported, so we expect all of those figures to be a significant underestimate. The task force reports there are currently 127 major police investigations underway on child sexual exploitation and gang grooming across 29 different police forces. Many major investigations have involved Pakistani heritage gangs, and the police task force evidence also shows exploitation and abuse taking place across many different communities and ethnicities. But the data on ethnicity of both perpetrators and victims is still inadequate. As I said last week, we will overhaul the data we expect local areas to collect as part of a new performance management framework. But I've also asked the Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force to immediately expand the ethnicity data it collects and publishes, gathering data from the end of the investigation when a fuller picture is available, not just from the beginning when suspects may not yet have been identified. But in order to go much further, I have asked Baroness Louise Casey to oversee a rapid audit of the current scale and nature of gang-based exploitation across the country and to make recommendations on the further work that is needed. The specific 2022 IICSA report, Child Sexual Independent Inquiry report on gang exploitation concluded that an accurate picture of the prevalence of child sexual exploitation could not be gleaned from the data and evidence it had available. So this audit will seek to fill that gap. It will look at further evidence that was not previously available, including that collected by the Police Task Force and including the new problem profiles compiled by police forces, and it will include an equivalent audit of child protection referrals. It will properly examine ethnicity data and the demographics of the gangs involved and their victims, and will look at the cultural and societal drivers for this type of offending, including amongst different ethnic groups. And it will make recommendations about further analysis, investigations and actions that are needed to address current and historic failures. Baroness Louise Casey was the author of the No Holds Barred 2015 report into child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, and I have therefore asked her to oversee this rapid 3-month audit ahead of the launch of the Independent Commission into Adult Social Care. In many areas across the country, the focus must now be on further police investigations and implementing recommendations to improve services. But we will also provide stronger national backing for local inquiries where they are needed to get truth and justice for victims and survivors. The Prime Minister and I both met last week with survivors from Telford, who had enormous praise for the way that local inquiry was conducted after there had been failings over very many years. And that inquiry led to tangible change, including piloting the introduction of CCTV in taxis, appointing child sexual exploitation experts in local secondary schools. And as we've seen, effective local inquiries can delve into far more local detail and deliver more locally relevant answers and change than a lengthy nationwide inquiry can provide. So Tom Crowther, KC, Chair of the Telford Inquiry, has agreed to work with the Government to develop a new framework for victim-centred, locally led inquiries where they are needed, and as a first step, to work with Oldham Council and up to 4 other pilot areas. That will also include support for local authorities who want to explore other ways to support victims, including local panels or drawing on the experience of the Independent Inquiry Truth Project. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government is already drawing up a duty of candour as part of the long-awaited Hillsborough Law. So we will also work with mayors and local councils to now bolster the accountability mechanisms that can support and follow up local inquiries to ensure that those who are complicit in cover-ups or to try to resist scrutiny are always robustly held to account and truth and justice are never denied. This new package of national support for local inquiries will be backed by £5 million of additional funding to get further local work off the ground, because at every level, getting justice for victims and protecting children is a responsibility we all share. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we cannot ignore the way in which child exploitation is changing as offenders exploit new technology to target and groom children, and we should all be deeply worried about the pace and growth of exploitation that begins online. We're therefore bolstering the work of the Home Office-funded undercover online network of police officers to target online offenders and developing cutting-edge AI tools and other new capabilities to infiltrate live streams and chat rooms where children are being groomed. And further measures will be announced in the Crime and Policing Bill to tackle those organising online sex abuse. Madam Deputy Speaker, nothing matters more than the safety of our children. Yet for too long, this horrific abuse was allowed to continue. Victims were ignored, perpetrators were left unpunished, and too many people looked the other way. And even when these shocking crimes were brought to light and national inquiries were commissioned to get to the truth, the resulting reports were too often left on the shelf as their recommendations gathered dust. So under this government, that has changed. We are taking action not just on those recommendations, but on the additional work we need to protect victims, put perpetrators behind bars, and to uncover the truth wherever things have gone wrong. This is about the protection of children, the protection of young girls, and the radical and ambitious mission we have set for this government to halve violence against women and girls in a decade. And I hope all ministers will support that mission and support the measures we have outlined today to help achieve it. I commend this statement to the House.
I call Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let us start by remembering the victims of this scandal. Thousands of young girls, often in their early teens, were systematically raped by gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Those in positions of authority, the police, local councils, the CPS, ignored them, and in some cases even covered up these horrendous crimes because of absurd concerns about so-called cultural sensitivity. 10 days ago, the Prime Minister compounded this by saying it was a far-right bandwagon to raise these issues and call for a proper inquiry. Let me say this. It is not far-right to stand up for rape victims, and smearing those who raise this issue is exactly what led to the victims.
Order, order. The Shadow Home Secretary will be heard. Shadow Home Secretary.
Smearing those who raise this is exactly what led to the victims being ignored and the crimes covered up in the first place. So will the Home Secretary apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister for his language last week? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not true to say that the previous government did nothing following the IICSA report. The last government set up the Grooming Gang Task Force following the IICSA report, which led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year alone, and I'm glad the new government is continuing that work. In April 2023, the data collection on the ethnicity of perpetrators was initiated, but the initial publication of that, I think last November, showed the collection is incomplete. So will the Home Secretary ensure the police follow through on the work initiated in April 2023 and ensure the data is collected more comprehensively? And the mandatory reporting recommendation was introduced as an amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell due to the early election. And I'm glad the government say they will now pick that up and take it forwards. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, previous reports and reviews did not go far enough. The IICSA report itself was mainly not about these rape gangs. In fact, it barely touched on the issue and only looked at 6 towns. We now believe as many as 50 towns could have been affected, so IICSA barely scratched the surface. Now, the Home Secretary just announced government support for only 5 local inquiries. Let me say this is wholly inadequate when we know up to 50 towns are affected. So I have some serious questions for the Home Secretary. Firstly, how are the other 40-plus towns supposed to get answers to the questions that they have? And these initial 5 towns, how will they be chosen? And secondly, the Home Secretary said nothing in her statement about the powers these local inquiries will have. It seems they will not be statutory inquiries under the 2005 Act. That means these local inquiries will not have the power to compel witnesses to attend or to take evidence under oath or to requisition written evidence. So if that's the case, how can they possibly get to the truth when faced with cover-ups? In fact, it was precisely that problem, the lack of powers, that led the chairs of the Manchester local inquiry to reportedly resign last year, because they weren't given the information they needed by public authorities and they didn't have the powers required to force its release, and so they resigned. These powers are needed, the legal powers, because these crimes were deliberately covered up in some cases. We heard just a week or two ago from the former Labour MP for Rochdale, Simon Danchuk, who said that the then chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party told him not to raise these issues for fear of losing Muslim votes. Truly appalling. Now, not a single person has been convicted for covering up or ignoring these crimes. In my view, the criminal offence of misconduct in public office might apply. And moreover, those vile perpetrators who can be deported should be, every single one of them, changing the law if needed to do it, and using visa sanctions with countries like Pakistan to ensure they accept back eligible perpetrators. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Home Secretary has announced today is totally inadequate. It will only cover a fraction of the towns affected, and it appears these inquiries will not have the legal powers they need. That is why we need a proper, full, national public inquiry covering the whole country and with the powers under the Inquiry Act needed to obtain the evidence required. And it's not just me that thinks that. In the last week or two, the Labour MPs for Rotherham and Liverpool Walton have called for a full national inquiry, as has Andy Burnham, the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester. And I commend those members and Andy Burnham for their courage in speaking out. Recent polling shows the vast majority of the public want a full national public inquiry, including 73% of Labour voters. But most importantly and finally, so do victims. Jane was groomed and abused at the age of just 12. She was gang raped repeatedly. She told the police and she told her social worker. At one point, the police even found her being abused by an illegal immigrant. But instead of arresting him, the police arrested her. Jane still doesn't know if any of her abusers have been jailed or if any of the public officials who let her down so badly have been held to account. Jane now wants a proper national public inquiry. Home Secretary, why don't you?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are the most vile crimes against teenagers, against children, against young girls very often. They involve sadistic abuse, rape, and the most appalling trauma that can then last for very many years. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse ran for 7 years and took evidence from 7,000 victims and survivors across the country. And too many of those voices and the bravery that those victims showed has too often just been ignored. And whilst he says he took action, I'm afraid his party had 10 years to introduce a duty to report child abuse, to make it a responsibility on professionals to report, to make it an offence to cover up child abuse. That was something that I was calling for 10 years ago, the Prime Minister was calling for 12 years ago, and he failed to do it, and we have lost a decade as a result. The independent inquiry into child abuse also ran a 2-year investigation into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. And one of the shocking things that it found was less is now known and understood about the prevalence of this appalling crime than prior to 2015. So in that period, from 2015 to 2022, even after we knew about what had happened in Rotherham, and even after Baroness Louise Casey had identified the impact and the failure to address issues about race and ethnicity, again, the previous government went backwards on issues around gathering data and information and the need for proper evidence. And that is why this government has now commissioned Baroness Louise Casey to instigate a rapid review to uncover the prevalence of this appalling crime across the country, with no holds barred in the way that we know that she will conduct this inquiry, to actually fill the gaps in the evidence rather than rerun the same questions without the evidence and the data that we badly need. And I would also point out to him, his party also weakened the disclosure and barring rules in 2012, again making changes that I and the policing minister opposed at the time, and the independent inquiry has recommended reversing in order to keep children safe. Rightly, but again, his party failed to act. Now, I hope that the action that we have announced should be supported right across the country, including the duty to report child abuse, proper penalties to cover it up, stronger sentences for grooming gangs, new rights for victims to get an independent review on reopening their case, new action to reopen historic police investigations, new standard for the police to meet, a new victims and survivors panel, a new audit of the scale and nature of child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, led by someone who uncovered a lot of the problems in Rotherham, including their failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs, new ethnicity data to be gathered and published, which he failed to do, new national support for local inquiries, including the Telford model, victims panels, and new work on accountability linked to the Hillsborough law to hold failures to account, because we will strengthen the law to do so, and a proper timetable for taking forward the independent inquiry, because this has to be about action and about protecting children and keeping them safe.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think I heard the Home Secretary adopting my 5-point plan. So I thank her for that, and I thank everybody across the House who's been campaigning on this issue. But if I could ask for some clarity, did the Home Secretary say that she was going to be adopting all 20 of the IICSA reports, or just those in the grooming gang strand? Do local authorities, as well as the police forces, have to do a review onto their cases of CSE? She cites Telford, which was victim-focused, which was why it was so important, because we must have those victims and survivors' voices. But what they said they lacked, what Greater Manchester said they lacked, was the ability to compel witnesses. And a big strand of what we need to do is make sure there have been no cover-ups, and it's only if it's on a statutory footing that we can do that. I would also say, with respect, that I think Telford cost £8 million, and I think the Home Secretary said she was providing £5 million for the whole thing across the country. And why do we need another one in Telford when we know this is happening nationally? Can she assure us there will be transparency of the findings of all of these inquiries, reviews, audits? And is it possible that this could be UK-wide? Because I don't believe this is only happening in England and in Wales. It needs to be across the whole of the UK.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question. And to go through in turn, we will set out before Easter the timetable for taking forward the work around all of the recommendations from the main independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. She will know that some of those raise complex issues and some of those considerable work will need to be done. So we recognise that, and we have discussed that with Professor Alexis Jay. There are others which we can take forward swiftly, and those covered by the Home Office, led by the Home Office, we are taking forward swiftly, and the work is already underway, including on disclosure and barring, and also on the duty to report, which will be included as part of the legislation. On the local inquiries, the Telford, we are not redoing the Telford inquiry, she is right that in Telford they conducted an extensive inquiry that involved victims, crucially involved victims and survivors throughout, from the very beginning, designing the inquiry in the first place, and it has led to very substantial change and continues to have further follow-up work on it. So that is the effective model. We do need the local councils and police and crime commissioners and mayors and the government to work together on these, but we are providing the additional £5 million to help draw up. Tom Crowther will work specifically with the first 5 local authorities that want to do this in order to make this effective, to draw up so that we have a model that can then be used in other areas as well. And in terms of their ability to gather evidence and to make sure that there is proper accountability, there has to be clear accountability. This can't be a way in which areas or institutions can avoid scrutiny. Obviously, the work in Telford and in Rotherham, in the original work that Baroness Casey did manage to uncover truth in different areas, but there also need to be other new arrangements on accountability. And that is what we are working with the Cabinet Office and also with mayors and councils to draw up what new accountability arrangements would be to ensure that there is proper either follow-up or as part of those initial inquiries that you have that proper accountability framework in place. And we will link that to the duty of candour as part of the Hillsborough Law, because unlike the previous government, who frankly have never taken seriously issues around candour and responsibility and accountability for frankly the 14 years they were in power when they refused to bring in a Hillsborough Law, we will bring in the Hillsborough Law because we are clear there needs to be proper accountability for failure to tackle this abuse.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babaranda.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Survivors are tough, and I know from my own experiences of abuse as a child that I've spoken about in this chamber, that survivors have been subject to intense impact and blistering climates. But like a blade in a blacksmith's forgery, each strike has strengthened many survivors' character, mettle and spirit, even though they are experiences that should never be undergone in the first place. Every shock has emboldened our resolve to be the very sword carried by Lady Justice herself, or to at least see it wielded with strength, to see action taken and justice done. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, too many survivors' stories have been characterised by being ignored, hidden or gaslit. And recently, too many survivors' stories have been shamefully used as a political football by some in some corners of this House and beyond. And survivors' experiences are littered with gut-wrenching instances of where power holders have missed glaring opportunities to take action against child sexual abuse and exploitation. And history must stop repeating itself. We cannot afford for Professor Jay's findings, nor those from the inquiries announced today, to gather dust atop power holders' bookshelves, to get lost at the bottom of in-trays, nor to be banished to the depths of filing cabinets. And so, in line with the courage that it's taken for so many survivors to speak out on this issue, we Liberal Democrats, and I know many others, implore those in positions of power at all levels to step up too. That means those weaponising this issue for party political gain must stop now. Yeah. That means Professor Jay's 20 recommendations must be implemented from now. And that means the work getting these local inquiries set up must start from now. But survivors need assurance that beyond the areas that have been announced today, that they will be able to get justice in their cases as well. So will the Home Secretary share what the plan will be for areas beyond that she's announced today, and what legal powers will these inquiries have to ensure that they have teeth and justice can be delivered? We must all dignify survivors' experiences with action. We must honour all survivors' stories with reform. Lady Justice demands it, and so does the tempered sword that she wields.
Hear, hear.
And I welcome the points the honourable member has made on this extremely serious issue. And he was right that actually for many victims and survivors, what they need is a proper police investigation to go after the perpetrators, to prosecute them, to hold them to account, to get justice and to get those perpetrators behind bars. And that will help protect other young people as well. So I think one of the most important changes we're making is making it easier to get those investigations reopened where, for the wrong reasons, they have been closed down and actually justice still needs to be done. Giving victims the stronger right to review, to be able to go to an independent panel with their case and to have it independently reviewed so it can be reopened, and also asking police forces across the country to now review the closed cases and to look at pursuing new lines of inquiry with the task force support and to making sure that they can do so. For in terms of the areas that Tom Crowther, who did the Telford inquiry, will work with 5 areas on the kinds of inquiry that they may want to take forward involving victims and survivors, because I think that is crucial, is involving the victims and survivors in the design. But what we know is from one of the Telford survivors who has said, because she gave evidence to both the national inquiry and to the local inquiry, and she found that local inquiry was far more effective at getting the changes in that area and also easier for her to be able to give evidence to as well. So that's why we need areas to be able to learn from what Telford did effectively, but also to be backed up by a stronger arrangement for accountability, a stronger mechanisms to be able to hold local organisations to account if they are not complying, but we do also expect local organisations to comply and to be part of finding truth and justice for survivors.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the measures she's included in that, and thank her for her promptness in doing that. I'd also like to thank her team, especially the Minister for Safeguarding, for listening to and providing support to constituents who've gone through such horrific abuse. Can I ask my right honourable friend how she will ensure that not only the individuals who were responsible for this awful abuse are caught and convicted, but also those who fail to protect and to support these vulnerable young people, because it's not just young women that have been affected and older, it's also young men, and how they will be held to account. Thank you.
Margaret Friend is right to raise these important points. I know this is an issue she has worked on for many years. One of the things that we need to do is we actually need to strengthen the law on this. We need to have a much stronger legal framework in order to be able to make sure that there is proper accountability, not just the holding to account and properly punishing perpetrators of appalling abuse, but also holding to account institutions and individuals who fail to take the action that is needed to protect our children. And that means the duty to report, making it an offence to cover up child abuse, and also a duty of candour to be able to comply and to provide the information, to provide the transparency in these cases, and also looking at the other local mechanisms that we need in place in areas like hers and across the country to be able to make sure that there is proper accountability when things go really badly wrong.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement and my committee will look carefully at it. Professor Alexis Jay is in front of us on Tuesday next week and I'm sure we will come back with further points. But just 2 points today. The first is around duty to report. In many cases, reports were made, but the victims were simply not listened to and not believed. So what can she do to make sure that that changes? And I am not clear from her answers so far. Will the local inquiries have the statutory powers to compel witnesses, yes or no?
So, first point, she is right that reports were often not listened to and not followed up. And in some areas what that means is that although recommendations were made, there was never any follow-up. There was never the proper implementation of standards to be able to do so. So, for example, in policing, we have never had a proper police management, a performance management framework in order to be able to make sure that standards are actually being met and that there is proper follow-up as well. And we need that stronger performance management framework in place. In the Telford inquiry, they were able to make progress and they were able to get to the truth using an existing local inquiry framework, and that was able to be extremely effective. In other areas, we have needed to have other action, including, for example, action by inspectorates to follow up. So there are different approaches we can take. We believe that the current system is not strong enough, and that is why we have set out work underway involving the Cabinet Office and involving local mayors and local councils in order to make sure that we can strengthen the accountability arrangements to be able to both follow up and support local inquiries where they are relevant, but also to be able to use existing powers that are in place as well.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a barrister and a former Crown prosecutor for 14 years, who dealt with sexual abuse and rape cases, can I tell this House that sexual abuse and assault occur throughout the United Kingdom, are not specific to any gender, race or religion. I mean, you have to just look at the Palica case in France. But there is one group of victims who are often not spoken about, that is young boys and young men. The level of sexual abuse that relates to them is completely underreported. I think it's a cultural thing, you know, boys must man up or they can't be shown to their feelings. Can I ask the Home Secretary, therefore, that when she's looking at these things, can the people who are going to be looking into this inquiry look at the fact that the abuse of young boys in particular?
My honourable friend is right to raise this point because it's one of the issues, in fact, that was raised as part of the independent inquiry's 2-year review into child exploitation. It identified teenage boys, young boys who are being exploited, and often identified patterns where they were initially being exploited online. And what started as online abuse and grooming and then led to contact abuse and rape and the most appalling violations as well. So she is right to highlight this issue. It's extremely important that this is taken into account and is part of the way in which local councils and local police forces need to respond.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The House will be well aware that I have been consistently campaigning for a gang rape inquiry into child sexual exploitation across Keighley and the wider Bradford district for far too long now. So I welcome some of the points that the Home Secretary has made, particularly around the implementation of the 20 recommendations from the IICSA report. But unfortunately, I do not feel that the Home Secretary is going far enough. And there's just a few points that I would like to make, particularly around the ability at a local level to compel witnesses to give evidence. I have severe concerns around the amount of funding that will be put available. Will these local inquiries that the Home Secretary is wanting to advocate for be truly independent? And this isn't a case of a local authority marking their own homework. And will they lead to convictions? And also, Madam Deputy Speaker, when you have a local authority like the Bradford district, where local leaders have consistently refused to back my calls for a public inquiry, as has the Mayor of West Yorkshire and indeed the Deputy Mayor of West Yorkshire for Policing, Alison Lowe, how on earth are we meant to get across this barrier where local leaders are refusing to have an inquiry on this issue without the government stepping in and giving that statutory authority that we are demanding on this side of the House?
Well, I would say to them that obviously it's really important to ensure that there is independent scrutiny of he will be aware that the inquiry in Rotherham that was led by Baroness Louise Casey at that time used inspectorate powers and was also clearly independent and managed to uncover serious problems that had gone wrong in Rotherham at that time. So there are different ways in order to do this. The Telford inquiry was funded locally and also managed to involve victims and survivors and also managed to shape the inquiry in the way that that the victims and survivors wanted. That's also an important thing to do. But the other thing I would just say is, for all areas, right across the country, the most important thing is still to get police investigations into going after the perpetrators, getting them before the courts and getting them behind bars. And whatever else happens, we have to keep the centrality of getting stronger police investigations to pursue perpetrators at the heart of what happens.
Paul Waugh.
Child sexual exploitation and abuse are the most sickening, appalling crimes perpetrated against some of the most vulnerable youngsters in our communities. So can I strongly welcome this comprehensive new national plan of action to put victims first, and welcome the appointment of Baroness Casey to conduct a rapid review into the scale and nature of these grooming gangs. But can I also urge a cross-party consensus around this issue rather than the game playing and misinformation we've seen in the past week? The Home Secretary, the Safeguarding Minister and I have all been consistent that we should put victims at the heart of everything we do. My constituents in Rochdale know this issue is too important for political point scoring, and everything we do should put victims at the heart of what we do. That's not just for victims of the past, but victims of the present.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I know this is an area that he does a lot of work on, and he's right that the potential for the national audit by Baroness Louise Casey is to identify, properly to look at the scale and the characteristics of these appalling crimes right across the country, and also to then be able to make further recommendations about further work that may be needed, further investigations that may be needed as well. And we all know, anyone who has worked with Baroness Casey will know how independent and determined she will always be. But he's also right that this must still be about victims and survivors, and crucially protecting victims and survivors for the future, because we still don't have strong enough standards and strong enough protection in place. And unless those changes are made, we'll continue to let children and young people down.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and the steps the government has and is taking to address this very serious issue. I appreciate that the timetable for the implementation of the IICSA recommendations cannot be immediately shared, but waiting until Easter means that there's a big period where we need to take some action. So will she explain what immediate steps the government is taking to ensure that all alleged victims who come forward are treated and taken seriously and listened to, and immediate action is taken to address their allegations, to serve justice and protect these children?
Well, I can assure the Honourable Member that some of the recommendations we are already taking forward. Some will be in legislation and will take time to pass through Parliament, because legislation also needs to change. But we are also taking immediate action to change the victim's right to review, so that if victims have been to the police, if they have been to a local authority, including parents have been worried about their children and they feel like nothing is being done, victims will have a right to review, an independent right to review, not to just go back to the same police force or go back to the same Crown Prosecution Service, but actually to be able to go to an independent panel on child sexual abuse, to be able to get that independent look, so that we can get more cases reopened and so we can get the urgent action taken, which is what we need to keep children safe.
Natalie Fleet.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this action from a government that sees violence against women and girls as the national emergency that it is. With a Prime Minister, a Home Secretary and a Safeguarding Minister with records of taking action to deliver for victims like me and many in my constituency. So giving birth as the result of grooming is a story that far too many of us share. And there are so many reasons why children and the women that they grow into don't speak out. And I want to share one particular story today. It's about the victim that told me that the perpetrator has threatened that if she speaks out, he will have access to her child something he hasn't done so far. That means that she has to work so hard to hide his crime, to protect herself and her baby. Will the Home Secretary meet with me and other victims to talk about how we discuss changing the law to protect children born of rape? Thank you.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that incredibly important point, and also for the very shocking and disturbing story that she has told of victims continuing to be silenced, having already been through the most traumatic experiences, and then continuing to be silenced in order to protect the children, even though what actually needs to happen is that perpetrators need to be held to account and need to face the full force of the law. And she is right that we need to ensure that family courts cannot be used by abusers and rapists to persecute victims. I will happily meet her, and I know the Safeguarding Minister will too, and this is an issue that is also being taken forward by the Ministry of Justice.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, I think the House should be generous towards the Home Secretary. She's travelled a long way since last week by recognising there is a requirement for far more inquiries into the towns affected, and I think we should thank her for that. But there is still one thing crucial that is lacking from her presentation, her statement today, is whether these new inquiries will have the power to summon witnesses and require the production of papers. Now, only she, or the Secretary of State, or the Minister in the Act, can set up a statutory inquiry. In fact, the Minister specifying an inquiry can set the terms of reference, can decide whether it should concentrate on certain towns, can set the time frame, can set the budget, can appoint as many people as she wants to the panel so that different parts of the inquiry could run in different parts of the country concurrently. But is she really ruling out that any of these inquiries should be statutory inquiries? Because victims will only have the real freedom to speak out in either this place, this Parliament, as we have just very movingly heard, or in a statutory inquiry where they will be immune, legally immune from the consequences of anything that they say in an inquiry. Why can't she provide the victims with those protections?
So the strongest protection for victims continues to be through police investigations, and the police, of course, have full powers to pursue investigations wheresoever they may be found. There have been a series of local inquiries held in different ways, including the inspector investigation into Rotherham, where Baroness Louise Casey was the lead inspector and then did have powers to be able to get to the truth there, and also the Telford inquiry, which did not have those powers but still managed to uncover serious problems and also make serious recommendations. There are different ways in which to do this. We have made clear that we want to strengthen the accountability, powers and ability to make sure that there are answers given to local areas, and to do that alongside the work that we already have underway as part of the Hillsborough Law and as part of the duty of candour that we need to implement across the board.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for the really important steps that she's announced today. Nothing must come in the way of victims getting justice or being listened to, or for us learning all that we can about how we protect the victims of the future. So can my right honourable friend tell us, in terms of the approach that she is taking today, if there are lessons that come out of these individual local inquiries that are repeated across the country that enable us to be better able to protect victims in the future? How are we going to coordinate getting those? And in terms of the question that she's just been asked, can she just explain why she believes that the sort of statutory footing isn't the right way to go, and the localised way that she's suggesting will actually ensure we get to the truth?
Well, he's right that we need to make sure that there is a proper follow-up where there are recommendations. So there have been over 500 different recommendations, particularly actually predominantly around child sexual exploitation, with many more around child sexual abuse much more widely. There currently isn't a proper process to be able to follow them up. It's one of the reasons why the independent inquiry talked about strengthening child protection arrangements, for example, through Child Protection Authority, and having stronger arrangements in that way. It's one of the other reasons why we have said we need a new performance framework for policing in order to be able to have proper follow-up. We obviously have had already a statutory 7-year inquiry into child sexual abuse, and also a statutory 2-year investigation into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. Those reports have came out with really important recommendations, but one of the things that they identified was that, particularly on the issues around the gangs, there simply wasn't enough evidence or data to be able to do further work and further investigations, and that is why the next step has to be to have the national audit, the rapid audit that we have asked Baroness Casey to undertake in order to be able to get a much more extensive assessment of the prevalence and also scale of the nature of child sexual exploitation across the country.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Right Honourable Lady will know that I wouldn't for one moment question her integrity, and I certainly don't question her intent. But I am perplexed by the methodology. Dame Baroness Louise Casey, I think I'm right in saying, has one or two other things on her plate at the moment, but if she is able to deliver this audit in 3 months, then that can only be a good thing. But in her statement she said that Tom Crowther has agreed to work with the government to develop a new framework for victim-centred, locally led inquiries where they are needed, and then to set up effectively 5 pilot schemes. That in itself is going to take time, and it's kicking the can down the road. Now, we all know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the select committees of this House can take evidence, generate a report and publish that report in short order. It doesn't have to take 7 years. No, it can take probably less than 7 months. And I cannot for the life of me understand why, having heard everything that the Right Honourable Lady has said, she is so resistant to, one, a broad-based national inquiry rather than a very narrow 5-town inquiry, and 2, why she is so resistant to the statutory measures that will allow that inquiry to compel witnesses and evidence.
Yeah, correct. Very good.
Well, as he knows, the importance of any kind of independent inquiry is, of course, its independence, and is, of course, the decisions, therefore, made by the chair in order to how those inquiries should be pursued. The report and the inquiry led by Baroness J into child sexual abuse took 7 years. Those were decisions made independently by Baroness J and by their panel, because they took evidence from 7,000 victims right across the country. They pursued detailed investigations in different areas, including into churches and religious organisations, including into residential homes and schools, and also including into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs on our streets. And that particular inquiry took 2 years as well. So what we want to be able to do is to do the rapid audit that fills the gaps that were left by the independent inquiry, for example, on the scale and the characteristics of child exploitation, child sexual exploitation across the country. That is the right thing to do in terms of the work that Baroness Casey will do. Secondly, to get more police investigations underway, including the victim's right to review, to get the police investigations underway. And thirdly, for Tom Crowther to be able to work with other areas where they have had local failings and problems and need to be able to pursue the kinds of local inquiry that Telford was able successfully to do in order to get to the heart of local failures and make sure that there is accountability as well.
White. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I remain shocked that only 2 MPs stepped up, attended and participated in the Alexis J 5-year inquiry into child sex abuse. My right honourable friend, Member of Parliament for Rotherham, and Lord Mann when he was the Bassetlaw MP. As the new MP for Bassetlaw, it is my duty my responsibility to carry on with this fight for justice. Wherever grooming gangs have been operating, whether they're in the white gangs, Pakistani origin gangs, church gangs, or behind the closed doors of private homes, the bright light of an inquiry, wherever they are needed, will expose who they are, where the cover-ups are, and who is responsible. Every single perpetrator should be hunted down and jailed. I have no time for the grandstanders or the people who turn a blind eye, and this is the biggest challenge of our Parliament. And I find it stunning that the Shadow Justice Secretary isn't in his place for this critical statement. Inquiries run in areas where the gangs are operating will give the sick and evil perpetrators no place to hide. National oversight from government is essential, ensuring swift legal action and the mapping of gangs, their links, their coordination, when and where they are ferrying girls from across the county lines is essential. And does the Home Secretary agree with me that we need to end this tyranny of child abuse and put words into action?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and these are terrible crimes which have been ignored for too long. There are currently 127 major police operations underway on child sexual exploitation and gang grooming across 29 different police forces. But one of the things that the independent inquiry identified was that this is something, child sexual exploitation happens across all police force areas, happens across all communities, and all areas should ensure that they have the proper systems in place to make sure that they're actually following up what is happening to missing children, what is happening to the kids that stay out overnight and who are vulnerable or who go missing from residential care homes, because too often that is still not happening, and too often we still get reports, even though those are basic things that all police forces should be doing and all local authorities should be doing. And that is why we've strengthened the powers for victims to get a review. That is why we are requiring police forces to now look back at those historic cases, because we know that there are cases that are not being reported, we know that there are cases that are not being investigated, and that is where the fastest action needs to be, to go after those perpetrators who are still on our streets and who are still getting away with it and will continue to do so unless police forces and local councils work together to put perpetrators behind bars.
Testimonies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I refer the House to my register of interest, and particularly to the fact that I'm a director of Whistleblowers UK, a not-for-profit organisation. I'm the last remaining MP of the 7 members of the House of Commons who originally called on Theresa May for an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. My experiences are on the record also. So I particularly welcome the acceptance of Professor Alexis Jay's recommendations and Baroness Louise Casey's rapid review into child sexual exploitation. Can I, though, draw the Home Secretary's attention to my concern about police investigations? Now, she's referred to the National Police Council and to reopening cases, but I am concerned about people marking their own homework, and we know that there is an institutional resistance to being found lacking and to deep scrutiny. One of the primary whistleblowers with whom I was involved has waited years for the truth to out, and she's been threatened with being sued by senior police officers, and it would appear that complaints can only be made about junior officers who are called and investigate, and that there is no ability to complain about senior officers. And I am aware, I'd ask her to please look at the IPCC and the IOPC reports, whether they have been published or not, particularly where they have not been published, and where they've investigated threats, where there have been threats, as I understand it, from the police of suing members of those organisations about the findings that they have made. I think it's incredibly serious that we have organisations like the Independent Police Commission and
Home Secretary.
Office for
Home
Police.
Secretary. Order. Home Secretary.
I'm happy to follow up with her about the very serious issues she raised. And she's right to say this cannot be about institutions just marking their own homework. And that's one of the reasons why we have made now the right to review an independent one. For child sexual abuse cases where victims feel that they have been let down by police force, by the Crown Prosecution Service, that they should be able to take that right to review not back to the same police force, but to be able to go to an independent child sexual abuse panel in order to get a right to review, in order to see whether they can get their cases reopened and properly investigators and perpetrators pursued. She also knows that there are other routes as well to hold police forces to account, including the police inspectorate, which my concern is currently, although it can make recommendations, and for example, it has just found serious failings in Cleveland Police's response to child sexual exploitation, but too often those recommendations are not followed up because there are no powers to do so. So that's why we will also be changing the police management framework, performance management framework, to strengthen the ability of the inspectorate and also of the Home Office to ensure that action is taken to improve performance and to actually implement recommendations for improvement where there are serious problems that are found. And happy to talk to her about the wider policing reform that's needed to make sure that there is accountability.
Harpreet Uppal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the statement from the Home Secretary? And I know she's not in her place right now, but can I pay tribute to the member for Bolsover for sharing her story, which I know is very difficult to do, and the continued work that she's doing to support victims. It's really important that we finally act for victims and survivors. And can I welcome that the Home Secretary will be acting on the inquiry's recommendations. But can I urge her that the monitoring on the progress of those actions are public, and that she returns to the House to provide regular updates on those actions and that they are published. Thank you.
My honourable friend is right. We will need a process to be able to keep up to date in the things that happen, the next steps that are taken forward. We will do that through the Victims and Survivors Panel that my honourable friend, the Safeguarding Minister, will be establishing, and also through regular updates as a result of the work that the cross-departmental group of ministers will be doing to pursue and take forward some of the recommendations.
Rebecca Smith. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the announcement today, and it's great to see some progress. And I won't cover what's been said about the legal powers piece, but I'm interested in the funding, because having led a commission back in Plymouth, the money that was used to pay for that came from the in-year budget of that local authority. And I appreciate the £7 million in total that has been announced. But you've talked a lot about the police. What additional funding are they going to receive to do this on a local level? What is the additional funding for the practicalities of that inquiry outside of those initial 5 local authorities? And also, what funding is going to come forward for the interventions that might be recommended following the inquiries? Because we know local authorities are incredibly cash-strapped. This could potentially disincentive them to follow through on these local inquiries. And finally, is that £7 million new money into the Violence Against Women and Girls budget, or is it money that would have been spent elsewhere?
So the funding to support the various measures that we're taking forward, we identified up to £10 million for additional investment to be able to support further action. But I can't just stress enough that this has to be part of the mainstream work that agencies do, that police forces do, that local councils do as well, because tackling child sexual exploitation and abuse cannot just be an add-on. It can't be something that is only done if there is a particular announcement from the government. It's actually got to be done as part of their core responsibilities. The funding for police forces, the funding for local councils, and it's why we also want the work around violence against women and girls, the mission that we have set to halve violence against women and girls, again, to be the central mission right across agencies and right across the government as well.
I appreciate this is a very sensitive subject, but if the questions are long and the answers just as long, we're going to get very few people in. Chris Murray, show us how it's done.
Deputy Speaker. In her report, Alexis J notes that 1 in 20 boys and 1 in 6 girls in the United Kingdom is estimated to be a victim of sexual abuse. And we have had scandal after scandal in care homes and councils, in schools and in churches of grooming for decades. So can I welcome the appointment of Baroness Casey for her rapid review into grooming. I welcome that it is rapid because these victims deserve justice. And it is unbelievable to my mind that grooming is not an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offenders. Will the Home Secretary commit to restate her commitment to ensuring that it is an aggravating factor, that this will be done quickly and that it will be done by force, so child sexual offenders are properly punished by the law?
Well, my honourable friend is right. The inquiry identified 500,000 children being victims of abuse, sexual abuse, every year. And the majority of cases are sadly within the family, and the betrayal by those who children should be able to expect to protect them. But there have also been huge betrayals, as he says, in residential homes, in other institutions, including faith institutions, the Church of England, the Catholic Church, as well as wider grooming online and on the streets in these terrible crimes. So yes, we will change the law, we will strengthen sentencing, we will make it an aggregated factor, because the punishment should fit this terrible crime.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's much to welcome in the Home Secretary's statement this afternoon, but she's resisted 6 invitations from honourable members to confirm that these government-supported local inquiries will have statutory powers. Instead, the Right Honourable Lady is relying on the duty of candour, responsibility and accountability. So let me try a different way. Does the Home Secretary is 100% certain that the duty of candour, responsibility and accountability is equivalent to statutory?
Well, what we need is to make sure that the crimes are investigated and also that there is proper follow-up in those areas where things have gone badly wrong. And we know that there are some areas where things have gone badly wrong. So the first stage has to be for the police to have full powers to be able to pursue these crimes and to be able to follow them wherever the evidence takes them, in order to be able to put perpetrators behind bars, because frankly that is where they should be in order to protect children and to keep them safe. And we also need to ensure that where things have gone wrong, there are sufficient powers to be able to get to the truth, sufficient ability for local organisations to be able to do that, and that no one can hide from accountability, no one can run away or obfuscate or use bureaucracy to get away with providing the answers and the justice and the accountability that victims need. So that is why we have set up a new programme of work to look at how you strengthen the powers available, how you strengthen the accountability available. Part of that has to include the duty of candour. Part of it also has to include the duty to report, because there has to be these stronger responsibilities on people to report child abuse in the first place and to make it actually a criminal offence to cover it up. Because if the law isn't strong enough, we won't get the accountability and the action as well.
Anna Dixon. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would encourage members opposite perhaps to heed the appeal from the Honourable Member for Eastbourne to stop scoring political points on such an important and sensitive subject. But I would like to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I really welcome the Home Secretary's announcement, in particular this government's commitment to take action to protect victims and secure justice by accelerating investigations and prosecutions. But can the Home Secretary confirm the support is there so that police forces like those in West Yorkshire have the resources they need to investigate and prosecute perpetrators of these horrible crimes?
Well, thank the Honourable Member for her question. We have increased the resources for police forces across the country by up to £1 billion next year. But also it's really important that all police forces see these kinds of crimes against some of the most vulnerable people in society as part of the core work on public protection and on keeping people safe that they must do.
Thank you very much. Can I start with paying tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Keighley and Ilkley, for his persistent campaign to get an inquiry into Keighley and Bradford. Home Secretary, Scotland is not immune from grooming gangs. Indeed, a survivors expert fears that grooming gangs are operating in every town and city in Scotland. So can I ask what discussions the Home Secretary has had with the Scottish Government about this to ensure a unified and coordinated approach across the United Kingdom? And lastly, just to add my voice to those others within the Chamber, why on earth can this inquiry not be backed by statute? The Inquiries Act of 2005 gives all the accountability and assurances that victims need and the communities need to ensure that the process is followed properly.
Well, he is right to talk about the child sexual exploitation and abuse that takes place in every corner of the United Kingdom. Obviously, the issues that involve police forces, we have responsibility from the Home Office for the England and Wales police forces, and therefore some of the changes that we are making around the review panel and the issues around performance, management and proper data on these areas will apply to England and Wales police forces. However, we're also working with the National Police Chiefs Council, which, as he will know, works very closely with Police Scotland as well to ensure that there is a national approach. And then what I would also say is we've obviously had the national inquiry, a nationwide inquiry into the both the child sexual abuse more widely and also into child sexual exploitation. It's really important that we fill the gaps in the evidence and that we actually take forward those recommendations alongside supporting those areas where there have been particular problems to get to the truth.
Chris Webb.
The news today that Baroness Casey will take forward a rapid review into the scale and nature of grooming gang offences, because I know as Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner on the front line in Lancashire that there's significant underestimate figures of levels of exploitation and abuse that goes unreported and unidentified in towns like Blackpool. So what will the government do to ensure that systems are in place for reporting these crimes and command the confidence of the victims and survivors?
Well, my honourable friend is right. There needs to be easy to report crimes, but there also, I think, has to be a proactive duty on police forces and on local authorities, child protection authorities, to actually pursue the evidence of where these crimes are taking place, even when they are not being reported. Because if kids are going missing from home, particularly from residential care homes, they may not be reporting crimes, partly because they are being groomed and exploited, and so therefore alongside making it easier for victims to be able to come forward and to disclose the terrible things that have happened to them, there also is a responsibility on the authorities to pursue crimes wherever they're found.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm usually measured when I come here, and I'm worried that actually the Labour government is playing us for fools here today. The Home Secretary has come here and picked 5 out of 50 towns and given no statutory powers. She's announced a review by the incredibly able Baroness Casey, but she's already doing a review into social care, and the review is not a review, it's an audit. Isn't the truth that the good members on the other side went back to their constituencies, and there are many of them across the country, and realised the strength of feeling felt by the public that this needs a national inquiry? This side get it, most of the backbenchers on her side get it. Why doesn't the Home Secretary swallow her pride and do a national inquiry?
I would just say to the Honourable Friend, I was a member that I was one of those who called for the independent inquiry into child abuse very many years ago, and supported the independent inquiry into child abuse, and also supported the 2-year investigation by that independent inquiry into child sexual exploitation, as well as some of the other investigations that it did as part of it. But we also have a responsibility to act when there are more than 500 recommendations from inquiries that are just sitting there with dust gathering on them. What we have to do is make sure that we actually get action, including the audit that we need from Baroness Casey, who will be taking that forward over 3 months before the Commission on Social Care gets going, and also making sure that we've got stronger police investigations, because frankly, if the police investigations don't happen, no one is going to get the protection that they need. And for Tom Crowther to work with the first local areas that want to take forward, local authorities, in order to develop a model and a programme that can be used in other areas wherever it is needed.
Jonathan Brush.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sexual exploitation is, without shadow or doubt, the most disgusting, degrading crime imaginable. And we have to, at all times, have the victims at the forefront of our minds. And I will say this. When members opposite bring forward amendments to important legislation that they know won't result in an inquiry, but will block child protection measures, and then spend the subsequent days spreading misinformation, they are letting victims down. No, I welcome the national audit into grooming gangs. I welcome the reopening of police investigations to ensure criminals are brought to justice. But can I just check, the Home Secretary said it a number of times, the 5 local areas that she's identified, they are initial areas, they are pilot areas, and the ambition is, wherever these crimes are taking place, local inquiries can take place.
My honourable friend is exactly right. Wherever there are serious problems or failings, where it's believed that local inquiries are needed, we want those areas to be able to conduct the kind of effective local inquiry that Telford was able to do, rather than having to start from scratch. And that is why Tom Crowther will work with 5 areas in order to be able to draw up how do you most effectively learn the lessons from what happened in Telford, where victims and survivors felt supported and also felt that they delivered change, that things actually happened as a result, as opposed to just inquiries that sit on a shelf and let everybody down.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As well as withheld court transcripts, I've been pushing the Ministry of Justice for data on the following. How many Pakistani or other foreign rapists have been deported, are still in prison, did not serve a custodial sentence, are back in the same community as their victims, had previous convictions, have reoffended, full nationality breakdown of those involved in the gangs? The response: the requested information is not centrally identified in the data systems relevant to these questions. Now, if this was a state inquiry into the private sector, they would be accused of negligence. Now, my view on this, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we firstly need a full national inquiry. This is a rotting stain on our country, and it needs to be exercised in full. It cannot continue to be kicked into the long grass. The British public want transparency, and they want to know the reason why this has taken so long to be dealt with.
Well, I would say to the honourable member that we do believe that better data needs to be collected, more comprehensive data. That's why I've said the overall data on child sexual abuse needs to be overhauled, including I'm making immediate changes to the gathering of data on ethnicity, on both perpetrators and victims, because the system that we inherited from the previous government simply isn't strong enough, but we will need further changes as well. And on the issue around the foreign national offenders, where people have committed where foreign citizens have committed sexual offences in this country, they have no right to stay in this country, and we have to increase returns. And that is why, rightly, this government has increased returns of foreign national offenders by over 20% since the election.
The announcements the Home Secretary has made today. Disclosing abuse is a very difficult thing to do. Many victims speak out, but too often their words are not heard, or they're not taken seriously, or they fall between multiple agencies. So will the Secretary of State investigate how we can assist victims to disclose in the first place, and also ensure agencies act on those disclosures? Thank you.
My honourable friend is right to make this important point. One of the things we want to do by establishing a victims and survivors panel to work with the safeguarding minister, with other ministers on the taking forward of recommendations around sexual abuse, is in order to make sure that we are recognising those experiences actually about exactly how difficult it can be to come forward, and how people need to have the confidence that if they do come forward to do something incredibly difficult, that they will be listened to, that they will be taken seriously, and that investigations will follow.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome and thank the Minister for her in-depth explanation of what the Government is and will be doing to ensure the safety of our children in the face of the most heinous of crimes. Since the vote on the amendment to the Children's Wellbeing Bill last week and the subsequent attention the vote attracted in the media, many of my constituents have written to me upset, angry and in fear over the grooming scandal. All the correspondence received demand the need for a public inquiry into the scandal to determine the failures, historic and present, on the part of the institutions involved which led to these heinous crimes against vulnerable children to go on for so long, so wide without being stopped and without the victims of the historic crimes being safeguarded and protected sufficiently. Madam Deputy Speaker, I finish with asking the Minister to confirm whether northern towns, like my own constituency in Blackburn, crimes of this specific nature of grooming gangs are still continuing to haunt our streets and vulnerable children, and whether further public inquiries are needed, whether further reports are needed to find out why this has gone on for such a long time. We need to provide Madam Deputy Speaker, as I conclude, we need to provide my constituents and everybody across the country solace.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and the two-year inquiry into child sexual exploitation concluded that child sexual exploitation is happening right across the country, that action is needed right across the country, and there are currently, the task force reports, 127 major police operations underway on child sexual exploitation and gang grooming across 29 different police forces, and that is why it's so important that recommendations from those inquiries are implemented, that we actually get action to protect children, to protect young people who too often are let down when inquiry recommendations are ignored.
I need you to work with me to get the final 10 members in, otherwise there'll be a lot of disappointment. And if you haven't been in here bobbing the whole time, there's no point trying to catch my eye now. Luke Murphy. Oh, forgive me. George, David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the statement from the Home Secretary, a statement full of action. And I'm pleased that last week I supported the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill to start implementing much-needed safeguarding measures, unlike some of those opposite who attempted to wreck the bill, spread misinformation, which led to abuse online towards many members. And it's on that point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I ask the Home Secretary whether she is aware and shares my concern about the most rapidly evolving form of child sexual abuse taking place online, including artificial intelligence facilitated child sexual abuse material. Can the Home Secretary outline what plans the Government has to tackle and strengthen the law in this area?
My honourable friend is exactly right, as well as the measures in the Child Wellbeing Bill, including on proper identification of children to strengthen child protection, which is crucial. We also need much stronger measures to tackle online abuse and exploitation. I feel really worried about the pace at which this is escalating, that it involves both online grooming and abuse and indecent images, but also the impact of drawing young people into contact abuse as well. We will bring forward new laws in this area.
Can my right honourable friend confirm that the new Victims and Survivors panel will have representation from regions across the country to ensure that victims' voices are heard loud and clear? And would she also agree with me that we need to dial down political opportunism that we've sadly seen from some members on the opposition benches?
Yes, the Victims and Survivors panel will include people from all across the country. And I think the inquiry into child sexual abuse did have cross-party support, and I really hope there will be cross-party support for implementing the action that we need and that I have set out today.
Jill German.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
As my honourable friend has pointed out, the victims panel really does need countrywide representation. So as a Welsh MP, can she confirm to me that Welsh voices will be heard loud and clear?
We'll ensure that Welsh voices are heard loud and clear.
Ben Coleman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my constituents have contacted me with their concerns about child abuse and child exploitation, and they will be relieved, I think, that the government is no longer, as the previous government did, allowing this to be kicked into the long grass, but is taking action, not least with the KC Rapid Review. And one thing I think they'll be concerned about is the fact that official figures at the moment underestimate woefully the scale and the nature of grooming activities. And how can the Home Secretary ensure the House, ensure me and my constituents, that in future the reporting systems will be such that they can guarantee the confidence of victims and survivors?
My honourable friend is right, and some of this is about giving victims and survivors the confidence to come forward and report abuse. Some of it is getting agencies and organisations to take seriously the risk factors so that they identify potential crimes and pursue them as well. And some of it is making sure that we have much stronger data requirements on police forces, on local authorities, so that we're collecting information and data. This was the first recommendation of the independent inquiry. We are taking it forward. It has been not taken forward for far too long.
Sean Woodcock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for her statement. There are victims and survivors in many communities, including my own of Banbury, and I welcome the steps that she has announced. I also want to commend the contribution to debate by my honourable friend, the member for Bolsover, and the honourable member for Eastbourne. Because I would ask the Home Secretary if she agrees with me that the voices that matter when we discuss how we tackle these issues are not those of billionaires, politicians or talk show hosts seeking to weaponise the pain and suffering of the victims and survivors, but it is those victims and survivors themselves who we should be listening to above all.
My honourable friend is right. We need to make sure victims and survivors are at the heart of this. 7,000 victims and survivors did give evidence to the independent inquiry. That is a really hard thing to do. So we owe it to them to make sure that there is action as a result of the testimony they gave, rather than just leaving inquiries to sit on the shelf.
Peter Swallow.
Madam Deputy Speaker, a number of constituents have contacted me on this serious issue, and I've made it clear I'd welcome any further inquiry that was able to command the support of experts and victims and build on the recommendations of the J report, rather than choosing to ignore them or delay action. Will my right honourable friend confirm that's exactly what she set before the House this afternoon? And does she believe, as I do, that on this basis these measures should command support from across the House?
Well, I do hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these measures do command cross-party support, because ultimately we need the stronger action from policing, from local authorities. We need cross-government action and action across communities to do the things that we have been told need to change for more than 10 years, and yet for too long they simply haven't. And that's why we urgently need this action to keep children safe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the statement today from the Home Secretary on the actions she will take to implement the Professor Alexis Jay recommendations. There are another set of recommendations by Professor Jay on which my constituent has been campaigning, and those are the recommendations on safeguarding the Church of England. Professor Jay called for an independent process for safeguarding oversight and operations within the Church. The Synod is discussing this next month, but will the Home Secretary agree with me that measures must be brought forward before this House to be approved by this House without delay?
My honourable friend is right to point out that there were obviously many further inquiries as part of the overarching national inquiry into child abuse, including on church and faith organisations as well. Some of the recommendations were for those organisations to take forward. They do need to ensure that they do, and that they are responding, and that they have strong enough child protection arrangements in place. But we will be monitoring and looking at the recommendations from all of those reports as well.
Sam Rushworth.
Thank you. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her answers today that have already clarified a number of the questions that I would have wanted to raise with her. I'm also grateful for the victim-centred approach that she's taken. One of the challenges, I think, though, is that when a child is being groomed for sexual exploitation, that person doesn't always know that they're a victim at the time until they're an adult living haunted by the past. And so I wonder what more can be done to help children to recognise themselves what is happening in their lives.
I welcome the really important point my honourable friend has made, and we see this as part of the wider work we're doing around tackling violence against women and girls, is actually to ensure that children, that young people have the confidence to be able to recognise abuse, to be able to recognise exploitation, and it is something that I know the Education Secretary takes immensely seriously and is looking at how to take forward.
Final question, Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sex exploitation is a vile crime that violates the trust, safety and dignity of children. Perpetrators of such despicable crimes, individuals or groups, no matter what race, religion or creed, must face the full force of law. Can I commend the Home Secretary with her statement today and the steps that are set out in her statement, especially victims' right to review, because there are so many victims that feel that the authorities have neglected their position. Can the Home Secretary please give a timetable in relation to the duty of candour, even an estimate, because the Home Secretary, I'm sure, will know justice delayed is justice denied.
Well, I can tell the House that the work is underway at the moment on the drawing up of the Hillsborough Law. It was part of the King's speech to be taken forward as a priority in this Parliament, and that work is being done across the Cabinet Office and across the with the Ministry of Justice support as well. But it is part of the wider work we are looking at how to make sure there can be proper accountability where there are things that fail, where people are let down, alongside both the duty of candour and also the duty to report.
Well done for everyone that kept their questions short. We most definitely got everybody in. Thank you to the Home Secretary. I'll give the front benches a few moments to swap over.